At 72, I woke to a flood of bank alerts on my phone. In just 8 minutes, my entire life savings of $225,000 was gone. The night before, my son had handed me a glass of lemonade with a smile I thought I could trust. I lay there frozen, the taste still lingering, as a truth too heavy to bear settled in my chest. I had no idea that drink was the start of something that would break more than my bank account, and what came next would change my family forever. It started the moment I reached for my phone on the nightstand. The screen was lit with a row of unread text messages from the bank, each one colder than the last. The first said a transfer of $45,000 had been made from my account. The next, 60,000 more. By the time I reached the final alert, my chest felt tight. $225,000 gone. The timestamps showed it had all happened within 8 minutes, in the middle of the night, while I was asleep. For a moment, I just stared at the numbers. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears, a heavy drumbeat that made my hands shake. I could feel a chill moving through me, from my shoulders down to my fingertips. It was like my body understood before my mind could catch up. I sat there on the edge of my bed, the light from the phone casting long shadows on the walls, wondering how something so unreal could feel so final. I tried to tell myself it had to be a mistake. Maybe it was fraud. Maybe the bank would fix it in the morning. But the pit in my stomach was too familiar, like the feeling you get right before bad news changes your life. And then my mind went back to last night. It had been ordinary, almost pleasant. Derek came by around dinner time. I had made a simple meal, roasted chicken with vegetables, the kind he used to love when he was a boy. He was in a talkative mood, going on about some new business opportunity. He talked fast, almost too fast, like he wanted me to catch his excitement before I had time to question it. Somewhere between clearing the dishes and sitting down in the living room, he offered to make me a glass of lemon water, said it would help me sleep better. I remember thinking it was sweet of him, even though it was unusual for him to fuss over me like that. I told him I usually drank tea at night, but he insisted, handing me the glass with a smile that reached his eyes, just enough to make me take a sip without another thought. We talked about small things, the weather, a memory from when he was little, until I started feeling heavier than usual. My eyelids felt like they were being pulled down by invisible weights. I excused myself, saying it had been a long day. Derek gave me a quick hug, said he'd lock up on his way out. Now, sitting in my bed with my phone in my hand, that moment came back sharp and uninvited. The way he had glanced at my phone earlier in the evening when I set it down on the counter. The small, almost imperceptible pause before he handed me the lemon water. The way his questions last night had felt off, casual on the surface, but digging into details about my routine, when I usually go to bed, where I keep important documents. I shook my head, refusing to go further down that path. Derek was my son, my only son. I had always been there for him through every misstep, every failed plan. He knew I wasn't rich by any stretch, but I had enough to live comfortably in my retirement. He also knew exactly how much losing that money would mean. But as I sat there, my thumb hovering over the bank's customer service number, the images from last night wouldn't let go. The faint creak of the hallway floorboards, sometime after I went to bed. The soft light spilling under my bedroom door for a moment before it disappeared. I had told myself it was nothing. Now I wasn't so sure. The phone vibrated in my hand again, pulling me out of my thoughts. Another message from the bank. This one was different. It simply read, "If you did not authorize these transactions, please contact us immediately." I swallowed hard and dialed. My voice sounded strange, detached, as I spoke to the representative, confirming transaction after transaction, all made from my device, all securely authenticated. The words barely made sense. How could I have approved them in my sleep? When the call ended, I sat in silence, the house around me unnervingly still. Morning light was creeping through the blinds, but it didn't feel like morning. It felt like the day had already taken everything from me before it even began. I didn't know yet how deep this would go. I didn't know what I would uncover in the days to come. But one thought settled in my mind like a stone at the bottom of a well. Whatever had happened last night was not random, and I was going to find out why. Derek arrived just before dusk, the sky still holding onto a pale strip of light over the pines. I had chicken in the oven and vegetables roasting on the lower rack, simple food that does not need fussing. He stepped in with the easy smile I knew from his better days, said he was passing through, said he wanted to catch up. I set another place at the table and felt the old reflex to make a little more of everything, just in case. We ate without ceremony. He praised the seasoning, said the carrots tasted like they came out of a restaurant kitchen, and reached for seconds with a practiced grace that softened his edges. Between bites, he drifted into talk about a new venture. He described a platform his friends were building, a way to move small businesses online with less cost. His voice carried that familiar lift, the promise that this time would be different. I listened with a steady face. I have learned that enthusiasm can be a kind of cover, a bright coat thrown over bare boards. While I rinsed plates, he lingered at the table and scrolled his phone. He told me the market had shifted, that timing was everything, that he finally had the right people around him. He spoke in clean phrases that needed no details. I loaded the dishwasher and nodded. I have spent years giving him room to say what he needed to say before life corrected the story on its own. He stood and began to tidy, carried glasses to the sink, wiped a small water ring from the table as if the gesture proved something. Then he moved to the counter where my phone lay, glanced at it, and slid it a few inches to the side to make space for the cutting board. The movement was ordinary enough to pass without comment, but my eye caught it and filed it away. When the kitchen was clear, he opened the fridge and lifted the pitcher I keep for iced tea. He said I should try something lighter for the evening. He took lemons from a grocery sack he had brought and rolled them under his palm on the counter to release more juice. He added a ribbon of honey and a few mint leaves he crushed between his fingers. The scent rose clean and bright. He said it was good for sleep. I said tea usually did the job, but he was already stirring the glass with a spoon. We carried our drinks to the living room. He chose the armchair near the hallway, the one that looks toward my office door. The television stayed off. We talked about the neighborhood, about a new family that had moved in at the end of the street, about a stray cat I had not seen since winter. He asked if I still turned in early. I said most nights I did. He asked if I kept my phone nearby in case of an emergency. I told him it rested on the nightstand. He nodded as if that were a sensible habit. I asked about his place, whether he had settled after the last move. He said the new apartment felt temporary but useful. He said the building had good internet and plenty of light. He did not describe furniture, friends, or routine. He pivoted back to work, to deadlines that lived just over the next rise. My chest tightened at the rhythm of it, the way his voice rode hope like a borrowed car. The lemonade tasted sweeter than the tea I brew for myself. It left a gentle warmth at the back of my throat and a heaviness in my limbs that felt pleasant at first. Derek noticed me relax and said I should let myself rest a little more, that sleep settles the mind. He kept his own glass mostly full. He spoke then about responsibility, about how he had come to see how much I had carried over the years, about how he wanted to lift some of that weight. The words were kind, and if this were a different decade, I might have let them carry me. He asked where I stored important paperwork these days. I said most of it lived on my computer now. He made a small sound of approval and said that was safer than leaving things around. I felt the first thread of unease move through me. It was faint, like a chill under a door. I folded the blanket over my knees and kept my face calm. When the clock slid past 9, I stood and said I would turn in. He offered to lock up after washing the glasses. His tone was gentle and practical. I thanked him and walked down the hall. At my bedroom door, I paused and looked back. He was at the sink, sleeves pushed up, head bent over the running water. The picture could have belonged to any quiet evening in any steady home. In my room, I placed my phone on the nightstand screen down, the way I always do. I smoothed the quilt and sat on the edge of the bed to breathe. The heaviness in my body deepened. Not unpleasant, but unfamiliar. I told myself it was a long day and that I should be grateful for an early night. From the hallway came a soft floorboard creak, then silence. I lay back and let the dark settle. The house held a calm that felt earned. I thought of how many times I had reset my faith in Derek, how many small beginnings we had named without speaking them aloud. I wanted to believe that this dinner marked one more of those turns. Sleep came in a slow wave. The last thing I remember was the cool ring of condensation left by my glass on the coaster and the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall. The quiet felt honest. It would take only a few hours to learn what that quiet had been hiding. That night, the air in my bedroom felt heavier than usual, as if the walls had pulled closer. I slid under the quilt, the faint sweetness of the lemonade still on my tongue, and waited for my body to settle. The weight in my limbs was deeper now, not the clean weariness of a day spent working in the garden, but something thicker, like I had stepped into water up to my chest. The house was quiet except for the small hum of the refrigerator down the hall. I heard the front door latch click softly, but it did not open. Then a muffled creak from the old pine floorboards outside my room. They have always been honest boards, giving away every step, and I knew exactly where that sound came from. I told myself Derek was locking up, maybe checking the windows, but the rhythm of the steps was slow, measured, as if he were listening for something. Through the slit under my door, a faint wash of light broke the darkness. It flickered once, then steadied. My mind reached for the familiar. Maybe he had forgotten to turn off the kitchen light, but the angle was wrong. It came from the direction of my office. The glow shifted, dimmed, and I heard a soft scrape, the sound of a chair sliding against the rug. I turned on my side, closed my eyes tight, and focused on the even pull of my breath. Whatever was happening, I told myself it was nothing. My son was under my roof, and I had always believed that meant safety. Yet the image of my office door swinging open in the dark pressed against my thoughts. My bank files, my laptop, my small box with the deeds and the will, it all lived in there. The weight in my body made it hard to move, but I shifted slowly, letting my hand fall over the side of the bed toward my phone on the nightstand. My fingers brushed the cool glass, but I did not lift it. I listened instead. The click of my laptop opening reached me like a thread in the stillness. I imagined the glow of the screen spilling over the desk, the familiar login page waiting. The temptation to sit up, to call out, rose in my throat and lodged there. I thought of all the times Derek had stumbled and I had steadied him, the years of second chances, the promises he had made over dinner hours earlier. My chest tightened. This was my son, and the mind resists placing certain shadows on the people it loves. Another sound came, softer than the first, a faint tapping that could only be keys. My mind played out what he might be doing, sending an email, checking a balance, moving numbers from one place to another. The thought of it scraped against me like grit in the mouth. A drawer slid open, the one on the left side of the desk. I knew the feel of that wood, the stubborn way it sometimes caught on its track. The sound stopped, then resumed, followed by the whisper of paper against paper. My breath stayed slow, though my pulse thudded in my ears. I pictured the envelope with my latest bank statement, the one I had not yet filed away. The light shifted again, dimmer this time, and I heard the quiet pad of footsteps moving back toward the hall. The floorboard outside my door gave another small groan. For a long moment the steps paused there, and I could feel the weight of someone listening. My grip on the quilt tightened. Then the steps moved away toward the kitchen. There was the sound of a cabinet opening, then the low rush of water into a glass. I tried to think of ordinary explanations. Maybe he was making another drink. Maybe he could not sleep and wanted to read emails. But the unease had rooted itself, heavy and certain, in the pit of my stomach. I lay there until the light under the door disappeared, and the creak of the armchair in the living room signaled he had sat down. A few minutes later, his footsteps went to the guest room. The door closed with a muted click. The house returned to stillness. I stared into the dark, tracing the edges of what I had heard. It could be nothing. It could be everything. My body was too heavy to sort it out now. The lemonade's sweetness had dulled to a faint aftertaste, but the haze it left was still thick around me. I turned on my back and felt the cool air on my face. My mind tried to tuck away the images, the light in the office, the sound of keys, the pause outside my door, but they stayed, like stains that refused to fade. At some point, sleep pulled me under. I dreamed of the garden in winter, the beds covered in frost, the soil locked and silent. A shadow moved among the bare branches, careful not to leave footprints in the snow. When I woke, just before dawn, the dream had already begun to dissolve, but the sense of something taken remained. The guest room door was shut. The hallway was dim with the early light, and the air held the faint scent of lemon and mint. I passed my office without looking in, walked to the kitchen, and filled the kettle. My hands moved through the familiar motions of making tea, but my mind circled back to the night's sounds. They did not belong to a stranger. They belonged to someone who knew exactly where to step, exactly where to look, and exactly how to move without waking me. The unease was still there, deep and quiet, as I carried my tea to the table. I told myself that by evening I would forget the creak of the floorboard, the light under the door, the soft scrape of a chair. But in the marrow of me, I knew those things would not be forgotten. They were waiting, patient and certain, for the morning to show me why they had come. The morning light barely crept through the curtains when my phone began vibrating on the nightstand. At first, I thought it was a single message, maybe from the community garden group or a reminder from my pharmacy. But the vibration didn't stop. One alert after another stacked on the screen, a rapid succession that made my stomach knot before I even picked it up. The first notification was from the bank, a transfer of $75,000 completed at 6:07 a.m. Another for $50,000, time-stamped 2 minutes later. Then one for $25,000, and more after that, each with a new amount. My thumb scrolled down, eyes darting to the time of each transaction. 8 minutes. In just 8 minutes, $225,000 had left my account. I sat frozen, the phone heavy in my hand. My heartbeat thudded in my ears, each beat echoing the numbers on the screen. I read them again, certain my tired eyes were playing tricks. But the digits didn't change. It felt as if the room tilted, the edges of my vision blurring. I gripped the quilt tighter, my skin prickling with cold. The first thought was pure disbelief. I had never authorized anything close to these amounts. My accounts were always secure, my passwords carefully kept in my head or on my locked devices. The idea that such large sums could vanish without my knowledge felt impossible, almost unreal. I swung my legs out of bed and stood, the floorboards cold against my bare feet. My mind reached back to the night before. The water with lemon, Derek's curious glances at my phone, his sudden interest in my habits, where I kept my laptop, the way he lingered when I unlocked my banking app. And then, the faint glow under the office door, the muted sound of typing I had tried to convince myself was nothing. The weight in my chest grew heavier. I tried calling Derek. The first ring went unanswered. The second call went straight to voicemail. I hung up before the beep. It was unlike him to leave this early in the morning, especially without finishing the coffee he always insisted on. The last I saw of him was a folded blanket on the couch and his duffel bag missing from beside it. I turned my focus back to the phone, opening the banking app in full. The screen displayed my balance, now a shadow of what it had been yesterday. Each transaction listed with a green check mark, each marked approved. The bank's note said authorized device. That phrase made my skin crawl. They were telling me these transfers had been confirmed from my own phone or computer, not by a stranger halfway across the world. I walked into the kitchen, set the phone down, and tried to steady my breathing. The kettle hissed on the stove, but the sound barely reached me over the hum in my head. I dialed the bank's customer service line. A calm, polite voice answered, asking for verification details. I recited them automatically, my own voice sounding distant. The representative confirmed what I feared. The transactions had been processed as legitimate, with the correct passwords and device ID. According to their system, there was no breach, which meant someone had physically accessed my devices and entered the information. I didn't say Derek's name out loud, but his face filled my mind. The lemon water, the sudden heaviness in my limbs, the faint smell of his cologne lingering near my desk. When I ended the call, the house felt unbearably quiet. The silence was no longer comforting. It was suffocating. My home, which had always been a place of safety, now felt exposed. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound sharper. I walked through each room, scanning for something, anything, that might explain what happened. My laptop was exactly where I'd left it, but the lid was closed, the charging cable coiled neatly, as if it had been put back with care. Too much care. I sat at the dining table, my hands clasped so tightly my knuckles ached. The disbelief was still there, but it was beginning to fray, making way for something else. A slow, creeping anger. Not the kind that bursts all at once, but the kind that settles deep, feeding on each new piece of understanding. The phone buzzed again. Another message from the bank, this time noting that all outgoing transfers for the day had been halted due to unusual activity. I stared at the words, unsure whether to feel relieved or more violated. The damage was already done. It struck me then that this wasn't a random crime. It was deliberate. Someone knew how to get into my accounts, someone who had enough access to my life to bypass every safeguard I had. And there was only one person who had been here, under my roof, within arm's reach of my belongings, just hours before the money vanished. I pressed the phone to my chest and closed my eyes, forcing my breath to slow. I wasn't ready to say the words yet, but deep down, the truth was already forming. The next step would not be panic. It would be careful, deliberate. Whatever came next, I would be the one to decide how it played out. I stayed at the table for a long time, the untouched tea cooling beside me, my gaze fixed on the morning light stretching across the floor. Each minute that passed made the picture clearer, and with it, my resolve. Something had been taken from me, but I wasn't going to let that be the end of the story. By late afternoon, the sunlight had shifted into that pale gold that makes everything look softer than it really is. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, not to scroll through recipes or watch the gardening videos I liked, but to comb through every inch of my financial history. The screen reflected my face back at me, tired but sharper now, the fog of disbelief replaced by a measured focus. I started with the most recent week. Each entry was familiar until the transfers from that morning, but there were smaller movements too, little withdrawals that had slipped by unnoticed in the noise of everyday life. 35 here, 100 there, tucked between grocery store charges and utility payments. They went back 2 months, always on days when I had been distracted, away from home, or at the community centre for volunteer shifts. My hand hovered over the trackpad. That meant whoever did this had been preparing for weeks, testing the waters before the big grab. The realization settled in my chest like a stone. I printed the statements, each page warm as it slid from the machine. I laid them out in order, tracing the pattern with a pen. The amounts grew gradually, almost like someone testing the limit of how much they could take before I noticed. It was methodical, not impulsive. Next, I opened my email, searching for any unusual notifications. Buried between store promotions and chems and newsletters was a message from 3 weeks ago, a security alert from my bank about a new device login. I remembered dismissing it, thinking it was my own tablet syncing after an update. But the timestamp matched a night Derek had stayed over, claiming his apartment's heat had gone out. I sat back, exhaling slowly. The air in the house felt heavier with each connection I made. I moved to my desk drawer, retrieving the small notebook where I kept my handwritten records, account numbers, payment due dates, insurance information. It was still there, but a faint smear of lemon-scented oil marked the corner of one page, the same scent I'd noticed in the kitchen the night before. The pieces fit too neatly to be coincidence. I reached for the phone and called my friend Martha. She was one of the few people I trusted completely, a woman who had been in my life for over 30 years, the kind of friend who remembered both my anniversaries and my worst heartbreaks. Her voice came through steady, and I told her only what she needed to hear for now, that something was wrong, and I needed her help going through legal options. She didn't ask for details, just told me she'd be over in an hour. While I waited, I began writing down everything I could remember from the last few days. The way Derek's tone had shifted, his sudden attentiveness, the timing of his visits, and the moments when I'd felt inexplicably tired or disoriented. I noted the missing duffel bag, the bank alerts, and the sequence of transactions. Each detail went onto paper, a timeline forming in front of me. Martha arrived carrying a leather folder and a small box of tea. She placed both on the table, pulling out a legal pad. As I talked, she wrote quickly, her pen scratching across the paper in neat, even lines. When I finished, she looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then said we would need to speak with her cousin, a retired attorney who had dealt with financial exploitation cases. I felt my pulse steady. This was the first step towards something that resembled control. We called him on speaker. His voice was warm but direct, and he asked Martha to send over copies of my statements, along with any correspondence from the bank. He explained that in cases like this, the challenge was proving intentional misconduct when the transactions appeared authorized. We would need evidence, not just suspicion. That meant securing my devices, running forensic checks, and documenting every interaction from here forward. When the call ended, Martha suggested we lock my accounts entirely until the investigation could begin. We spent the next hour on the phone with the bank, their fraud department walking me through the process. Every new password was written down on a fresh sheet of paper, stored in a sealed envelope Martha would keep for now. The house was dark by the time she left. I walked her to the door, the cool air outside carrying the scent of damp leaves. She promised to call first thing in the morning, after speaking with her cousin again. Back inside, I stood in the living room staring at the closed office door. My laptop and phone were locked away now, the chargers unplugged. The silence in the room was thick, the kind that amplifies every thought. I knew this was far from over. Whoever had done this would not expect me to push back. They would assume my age, my quiet nature, and my trust would keep me from taking real action. But as I gathered the printed statements into a folder, I felt something shift inside me. The fear was still there, but it had a new companion, a quiet, deliberate resolve. If Derek had taken from me, he had underestimated the one thing I had more of than money: time to plan, to prepare, to make sure the next move was mine, and mine alone. By the end of that week, the rhythm of my days had changed completely. The quiet mornings I once spent tending to the roses or reading at the kitchen window were replaced by phone calls, document reviews, and methodical note-taking. The investigation was no longer an abstract plan. It was in motion. Martha stopped by early on Friday, her arms full of manila folders. She had just come from her cousin's office and brought updates. We sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where this had all begun, and she slid the folders toward me. Inside were copies of preliminary reports, transaction logs marked with highlights, bank correspondence, and a list of recommended steps for securing additional evidence. Her cousin's advice was clear. This was the time to gather, not confront. That meant preserving every scrap of proof without alerting the person responsible. The key was to make the trail undeniable before taking action. I started with my own house. I walked from room to room with a small spiral notebook, noting the placement of anything that could be used to access my accounts: old bills, personal letters, tax records. A lockbox that once held property deeds now sat empty, and I wrote that down. Next came the digital side. My phone had been checked for remote access, but my home computer had yet to be fully examined. Martha's cousin arranged for a technician he trusted to stop by the following afternoon. Until then, I left the device unplugged in my study, the door closed and latched. As the day went on, I found myself watching the clock more than usual. Derek had not called all week. That absence spoke louder than his usual empty chatter. It meant he was waiting, perhaps hoping I would say nothing and simply accept what had happened. I made tea and settled at the table again, this time with my calendar. I began marking every date tied to suspicious activity: the odd bank alerts, his overnight stays, and the afternoons when I had been out. The pattern grew even clearer. Each larger withdrawal was made within 24 hours of him being in the house. By mid-afternoon, Martha returned from running errands. She placed a small envelope on the table, photos she had quietly taken of Derek's car parked near a branch of my bank earlier in the month. They were time-stamped. I slid them into one of the folders without comment. The next morning, the technician arrived. He was a quiet man with silver hair and a habit of narrating his work under his breath. I let him into the study and stayed nearby, listening as he explained that my computer had been accessed remotely 3 separate times in the past month. Each instance aligned almost perfectly with suspicious transactions. He printed a report and left a copy for me, his parting words calm but certain. Whoever had done this was not guessing at my information. They knew exactly where to look. That night, I sat in the living room with the folder on my lap. I read through every page, the weight of the evidence building until it felt almost solid in my hands. I thought about Derek's expression the last time he had been here, the false warmth, the way his eyes had scanned the room more than they met mine. I thought about the lemon scent on the notebook, the empty lockbox, the precise timing of his visits. This was no longer just a suspicion. It was a map of his choices, each one deliberate. By Sunday, the plan had taken shape. Martha's cousin would draft a formal statement for the bank's fraud division, supported by the evidence we had collected. Once the bank opened a case, the matter would move into legal territory, giving us leverage. We would not confront Derek directly until the process was underway. An unexpected move would strip him of time to cover his tracks. That evening, Martha came by again, and we sat in the fading light of the kitchen. I told her I was ready, not just to protect what was left, but to reclaim the ground I had lost. She nodded, her eyes steady, and said the hardest part would be staying silent while the gears of the process turned. I understood. Silence, in this case, was not surrender. It was strategy. When she left, I locked the front door and walked slowly through the house, checking each window, each latch. The rooms felt different now. Not entirely safe, but not entirely vulnerable either. Somewhere between the two, I had found the space to breathe. I placed the folder of evidence back in its drawer and closed it with care. This was no longer a story about what had been taken from me. It was becoming a story about what I would take back. Monday morning began with a sharp chill in the air, the kind that made every sound feel more defined. I was already awake before the sun came up, the folders of evidence laid out on my dining table in precise order. Every page had been read and reread, until I could almost recall the dates and figures without looking. The plan was no longer just an idea. It was moving toward its first real step. Martha arrived with coffee and a determined look. She had spoken with her cousin late the night before, and the instructions were clear. It was time to submit the packet to the bank's fraud division. Doing it early in the week would give them time to act before Derek had a chance to make any sudden moves. We went over the documents one last time, checking signatures, confirming dates, and making sure nothing in the sequence left room for doubt. By mid-morning, I called the bank manager directly. Her voice was polite, but carried a hint of curiosity when I mentioned the scope of the documents I intended to bring. We agreed on a time that afternoon when her office would be quiet. I hung up and sat still for a moment, the reality of the meeting settling in. Before leaving the house, I checked my phone. No calls from Derek. No messages. That silence had become its own kind of signal. He was keeping his distance, waiting for something, or perhaps assuming I was too fragile to act. That assumption was going to work in my favor. Martha drove us to the bank. The building loomed ahead, glass catching the winter light, every reflection feeling sharper than usual. Inside, the manager greeted us warmly and led us to her office. I placed the folders on her desk without unnecessary explanation. She opened the first one and began scanning the pages, her brow tightening slightly as she read. Every few minutes, she would glance up at me, then return to the documents. When she reached the photos of Derek's car outside the bank, she set them aside in a separate pile. The technician's report on my computer activity went into another. By the time she finished, the piles on her desk had taken on their own order: evidence, supporting proof, and action items. She leaned back and told me she would personally initiate the investigation that day. It would begin quietly, with internal audits, then escalate to formal action once the fraud division confirmed the findings. Leaving the bank felt different than entering it. The air outside seemed lighter, though the road ahead was still long. We didn't talk much on the drive home. The work now shifted from gathering to waiting, a slower but no less important phase. That evening, I sat in my study with the lamp casting a soft circle of light on the desk. I wrote down the sequence of what had happened that day, not for the bank, not for the lawyer, but for myself. It was a way of marking that the turning point had begun. The next 2 days were uneventful on the surface, but underneath, small changes were happening. The bank's security department called to confirm a few details, their tone professional and careful. They never used Derek's name directly, but I knew they were circling closer. On Wednesday afternoon, Martha stopped by again. She brought a small envelope, another set of photographs. This time, Derek was pictured entering a small office building on the other side of town. According to the date on the photos, it had been taken just the day before. We searched the address online and found it was a private lending office, the kind that dealt with fast cash against personal property. The implication was obvious. If Derek sensed the walls closing in, he might be trying to move quickly, shifting assets before they were frozen. The bank would need to know about this. I made a note to call them first thing in the morning. That night, I walked through the house, pausing at the front window to watch the street. The neighborhood was quiet, but my mind was steady, not restless. Every step I took from here on out had to be deliberate, leaving no trace that could tip my hand. By Thursday morning, the bank's fraud officer called to confirm that certain accounts had been flagged. They asked me to verify that I had not authorized specific transactions. My answer was clear. The officer's voice was calm, but I could hear the undertone of movement. Things were progressing. Later that day, I received a call from Martha's cousin. He told me that with the bank involved, the next stage would be to coordinate with legal channels. If Derek attempted to liquidate or transfer anything further, it could trigger an automatic freeze. The key was to stay quiet until the right moment to act publicly. When I hung up, I sat for a long time in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold. It struck me that the most powerful moments in this process weren't loud confrontations. They were the steady, precise steps that no one could see. Derek likely believed I was still in the dark. That belief would make the final move all the more decisive. As the day ended, I placed the latest set of photographs into the main evidence folder. The drawer clicked shut with the same quiet finality I had felt at the bank. This was no longer just about protecting what I had. It was about showing, when the time came, that every inch of ground I stood on had been fought for, and that I was not done yet. By Friday morning, the pattern of the week had shifted. What began as a quiet gathering of evidence was now edging into a more tactical phase. I woke early, went over my notes, and laid out the newest documents on the table. The photographs from Martha's cousin, the bank's recent transaction reports, and the printout of flagged accounts formed a clear timeline. Each piece fit neatly into the larger structure, and I could see how close we were to making it airtight. Around mid-morning, the phone rang. It was the bank's fraud division. They had cross-referenced my documents with their internal records and confirmed multiple unauthorized activities tied to Derek. The woman on the line said they were preparing to freeze the most active accounts before the weekend to prevent further movement. Her voice carried that same careful professionalism, but I could tell the decision had already been made. I thanked her, hung up, and sat back in my chair. The freeze would change everything. Derek would feel the impact immediately, though he would have no idea where it originated. The thought brought a quiet steadiness, not satisfaction exactly, but a sense that the ground was finally leveling beneath my feet. Martha arrived shortly after noon. She placed a manila envelope on the table without a word and poured herself coffee. Inside were copies of 2 signed contracts Derek had taken to that private lending office earlier in the week. The dates were recent, and the collateral listed was substantial, items I knew had been in the house for years. Furniture, jewelry, and even one of the vehicles. The contracts were proof that he was trying to convert anything he could into quick cash. We called the bank again and relayed the new information. The fraud officer asked if I could deliver the originals directly to them for verification, which I agreed to do. It meant another trip downtown, but the timing felt critical. I didn't want a single opportunity for Derek to slip through the tightening net. The ride to the bank was quiet. Both of us focused on the weight of what we carried. Inside, the officer met us at a side entrance and led us to a conference room. I placed the contracts on the table, along with the photographs and the sequence of events leading to their discovery. She flipped through them carefully, making notes in the margins. When she looked up, she said they would likely coordinate with law enforcement before the week was over. Walking out of that meeting, I felt the faintest shift in the air, as if the balance of control had moved slightly in my favor. We didn't speak much on the drive back, but I noticed Martha's grip on the steering wheel relax just a little. Later that afternoon, I received an unexpected call from my lawyer. He had been in touch with a contact who specialized in asset protection during fraud investigations. If I was willing, they could begin drafting legal measures to ensure certain properties remained out of Derek's reach entirely. The idea wasn't just to protect what was mine, but to prevent him from leveraging anything connected to my name in the future. By evening, I had signed the initial paperwork. It was a set of instructions outlining which assets were to be shielded under a trust, with clear clauses that would prevent transfer without my explicit consent. The lawyer said it could be filed immediately and would become effective as soon as it was recorded. The house was quiet that night. I moved slowly through the rooms, noticing the details that had always been there. The curve of the banister, the worn edge of the kitchen table, the framed photographs along the hallway. These were pieces of a life built over decades, and the idea of someone trying to strip them away in a matter of weeks had once felt unbearable. Now, with each careful step, I understood that the fight was no longer about loss, it was about preservation. Saturday morning brought a short email from the bank. The freeze had been executed late the night before. Multiple transactions had been stopped in progress, including a large withdrawal Derek had attempted. I read the message twice, feeling a calm certainty settle in. It wasn't the end, but it was the first visible crack in his plans. Martha came over with fresh bread from the bakery and the quiet satisfaction of someone who had just heard the news. We sat at the table, tearing pieces of bread, not needing to speak much. The silence between us carried more meaning than any hurried conversation. The rest of the weekend was uneventful on the surface. Derek didn't call, and there were no unexpected visitors. But I knew the stillness was temporary. He would soon realize something had shifted, and when he did, the real confrontation, silent or otherwise, would begin. On Sunday night, I gathered all the documents into a single binder. The evidence, the bank reports, the legal filings, everything was in chronological order. I placed it on the shelf beside my desk, its weight both literal and symbolic. This was the story as it had unfolded, a record of every step taken to protect what mattered. The week ahead would carry its own challenges, but for the first time in months, I felt anchored. The path forward was no longer clouded with uncertainty. I had taken the quiet route, the deliberate one, and in doing so, I had ensured that the next move would be mine to make. By Monday morning, the quiet tension that had settled over the house felt heavier. I woke before the sun, made coffee, and stood by the kitchen window, watching the pale light creep across the lawn. The weekend had been still, but I knew it was the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. Derek would have discovered the account freezes by now, and it was only a matter of time before his reaction reached my doorstep. I kept myself busy, checking the binder of documents one more time, making sure every page was in order. Martha called to let me know she had spoken with the bank again. The fraud team had flagged additional transfers Derek had attempted. This time through smaller accounts he must have thought were invisible. They were blocked just as quickly, which meant he was likely scrambling for alternatives. By mid-morning, the phone rang. This time it was my lawyer. He said Derek's attorney had reached out, asking for a discussion to avoid what he called unnecessary complications. The phrasing was careful, almost polite, but I knew it was an opening move to gauge what I knew. My lawyer suggested we wait before responding, giving Derek more time to stew in the uncertainty. I agreed. Around noon, Martha came over with lunch. We ate at the dining table, both of us aware that it might be the last truly calm meal for a while. She asked if I was prepared for him to show up unannounced, and I told her I was. The security cameras were working, the locks had been changed, and every critical document was out of the house. If he came, there was nothing here he could take. The knock came just after 3 in the afternoon. I didn't move right away, letting the sound echo once, then twice. When I finally opened the door, Derek stood there, his expression tight, eyes scanning the hallway behind me as if expecting to see someone else. He didn't step inside. Instead, he leaned against the frame and launched into a low, controlled tirade about misunderstandings and overreactions. I let him talk. The more he spoke, the more he revealed. He mentioned specific account numbers, transactions, and even the private lending contracts Martha had found. That slip told me he knew exactly how deep we had gone into his activities. It also told me he was worried. When he finally paused, I told him calmly that any further discussion should go through our lawyers. His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might push past me. But then he stepped back, muttering something about family loyalty, and walked down the path to his car. I watched him drive away, feeling a strange mix of relief and anticipation. The confrontation had been brief, but it had confirmed what I needed to know. He was off balance. That evening, my lawyer called again. He had just received an email from Derek's attorney proposing a private meeting later in the week. The offer included vague promises of mutually beneficial resolutions and a request to avoid involving law enforcement. I could almost hear the desperation behind the formal language. We agreed to hold off on any reply until after the bank finalized its cooperation with the fraud unit. The next day, I met with the asset protection specialist in person. We went over the trust documents line by line, ensuring there were no gaps Derek could exploit. By the time I left the office, the trust was officially recorded, and every major asset I owned was locked beyond his reach. The relief was quiet, almost invisible, but it was there. That night, as I sat in the living room with the binder open on my lap, I thought about how quickly the ground had shifted. Just weeks ago, Derek had been operating with complete confidence, certain he could move pieces around without me noticing. Now, every one of his steps was being tracked, blocked, and documented. The shift wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was irreversible. 2 days later, my lawyer forwarded me a set of bank statements from the fraud division. They showed Derek's accounts in near stasis, no significant withdrawals, no large deposits, only small, nervous transactions that looked like someone testing for weaknesses. Each one failed. By Thursday evening, I knew the next move would be mine. The binder was complete, the trust was in place, and the bank had aligned with the investigation. Derek could circle, threaten, or stall, but the reality was set. He no longer had access to what he thought he controlled. The house was quiet again that night, but this time, the quiet felt different. It wasn't the stillness before a storm. It was the stillness after the tide has turned. I sat in that quiet, letting it settle in, knowing that the real weight of what had been done would take time to show. And when it did, there would be no mistaking where the balance of power now rested. By Friday morning, the air felt charged, as if the entire week had been leading to this point. My phone buzzed just after sunrise with a text from my lawyer. Derek's attorney had sent a draft proposal overnight. I read it twice. On the surface, it looked like an attempt at reconciliation, but the language was riddled with vague conditions, hints of shared liability, and requests to restore familial harmony without external interference. It was an effort to lure me into undoing the protections I had put in place. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the proposal open on my tablet. Every line was designed to look generous while subtly shifting control back to Derek. He wanted me to believe he was willing to walk away from the tension if I simply returned certain assets and ceased further inquiries. It was a performance, and like any performance, it revealed more than it concealed. Martha came by mid-morning, bringing her usual calm energy. She read through the document in silence, then set it down and shook her head. We both knew this was Derek's way of testing whether I was still hesitant to take things further. If I so much as entertained the proposal, he would use it as leverage. I told her I intended to respond, but only through my lawyer, and only after the fraud unit had issued its findings. Later that day, I met with the lead investigator at the bank. We sat in a private conference room, the blinds drawn. She laid out the full report, and it was more thorough than I expected. The pattern of withdrawals, the timing of transfers, the linked accounts, all of it formed a clear picture of deliberate misappropriation. They had also uncovered evidence of accounts in other states, which suggested Derek had been moving funds for far longer than I had suspected. By early afternoon, I was back home, sifting through my notes, aligning them with the bank's report. Every page I compiled felt like another brick in a wall Derek would not be able to climb over. My lawyer called again, his tone steady. He advised we prepare a counter-proposal, not to accept any terms, but to make it clear we were in full control. The counter would be short, precise, and leave no room for negotiation outside legal channels. That evening, as I sat in the living room, I noticed how my thinking had shifted. This was no longer about reacting to Derek's moves. The dynamic had flipped. He was chasing, I was setting the pace. Even his attempts at intimidation, short, clipped messages sent through his attorney, were losing their edge. The more he reached, the more obvious his position became. Saturday was spent in quiet preparation. Martha and I went through the trust documents again, confirming each clause that made the assets untouchable. I placed the final, notarized copies in the safety deposit box. The act felt symbolic, as though I was locking away not just my property, but also the years of silent tolerance I had allowed him. By Sunday afternoon, I received a brief update from the investigator. The bank had formally frozen all accounts linked to Derek pending legal review. This meant he could not access any of the funds in question without clearance. And clearance was not coming. The message was clear, even without being said outright. He was cornered. That night, as the house settled into its usual quiet, I stood by the window looking out at the darkened street. My reflection stared back, steady and unflinching. The woman who had once ignored the signs, who had allowed her own space to be quietly diminished, was no longer here. Every choice I had made in the past 2 weeks had built a structure Derek could not see until it was too late. The phone buzzed one last time before I went to bed. Another message from my lawyer, confirming that the counter-proposal had been sent. It contained no openings for negotiation, no hints of compromise, just a firm statement of facts, backed by the documents and the investigation. The next move, if there was one, would have to come from Derek. And for the first time, I felt no dread about what that move might be. The shift was complete. I no longer felt like I was waiting for the storm. I had become the one setting the weather. Monday began with a stillness that felt deliberate, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The bank investigator had confirmed over the weekend that all linked accounts were frozen, but now the effect of that decision was starting to ripple outward. By mid-morning, my lawyer forwarded an email from Derek's attorney, this time stripped of the overconfident tone that had marked earlier messages. It was brief, almost clipped, requesting a clarification of my position and hinting at a willingness to consider alternative resolutions. I didn't need to read between the lines. Derek was feeling the pressure. Without access to the funds, without the ability to maneuver financially, he was cornered in ways that were both practical and personal. This was no longer about just money. His image, the one he cultivated so carefully among his peers, was starting to fracture. Martha came over just after lunch with a folder of documents we had compiled over the last few weeks. She had labelled every section clearly, highlighting the most damaging pieces of evidence in the bank's report. As we reviewed them together at the kitchen table, I could see the framework of the case becoming more defined. Every transaction, every paper trail told a story, and the story was not one Derek would want told in public. By late afternoon, my lawyer called with a development that sharpened the entire picture. The fraud unit had formally escalated the matter to the district attorney's office. That meant it was no longer just a civil dispute. There was now the potential for criminal charges, depending on how the DA's review unfolded. I listened in silence as he explained the next steps. It was clear that the balance had shifted even further in my favor. That evening, I sat alone in the den, the documents spread out in neat stacks on the low table. I thought about the arc of the past month, from the first signs that something was wrong, to the quiet gathering of evidence, to this moment where Derek's control had slipped entirely. The contrast was stark. A few weeks ago, he had been certain of his position, speaking through intermediaries as though I were already sidelined. Now, he was reaching, grasping for any path that would stop the momentum against him. But there was no path. Not anymore. The following morning, the DA's office requested a formal interview. My lawyer arranged the meeting, and by noon I was in a conference room at the courthouse, answering precise, methodical questions from the assistant district attorney. Every answer I gave was backed by documented proof, and every time I produced a copy of a statement or a notarized record, I could feel the case solidify further. When I left the courthouse, the air felt sharper, the sun brighter. The steps I had taken, quiet, deliberate, measured, were no longer just protective. They were decisive. The situation had crossed a line that Derek could not uncross. Back home, I found a letter in the mailbox. It was from Derek, not his lawyer. The handwriting was rushed, the tone wavering between apology and veiled accusation. He claimed he had acted under misguided advice, that he had never intended for things to escalate. There were no direct admissions, but the defensiveness in his words said more than any confession could. I set the letter aside. It was too late for him to rewrite the past. That night, I placed the final copy of the DA's intake report in the same safety deposit box where the trust documents were stored. As I locked the box, I felt a quiet certainty settle over me. The process was far from over, but my position was no longer in doubt. Derek's reach had been cut off, his influence dismantled piece by piece, not by confrontation, but by precision. The days ahead would be about resolution, but not reconciliation. I had learned too much to step back into the old patterns. And as I closed the door to the bank vault and stepped back into the cool evening air, I knew that whatever came next, I would meet it on my terms. The final meeting at the courthouse came on a clear morning, the kind where the light falls evenly, without glare or shadow. I sat beside my lawyer as the assistant district attorney summarized their findings. Derek's actions, combined with the paper trail we had built, had left little room for dispute. The settlement terms were straightforward, final, and binding. He would withdraw all claims, restore full control of the property and accounts to me, and issue a written statement relinquishing any future interest. There was no triumph in the moment, only a quiet confirmation that the ground beneath me was steady again. Derek avoided looking in my direction, his shoulders set in the rigid posture of someone holding back words they know will change nothing. His attorney handled the signatures, the passing of copies, the formal acknowledgements. It was over in less than an hour. Back home, I walked through each room slowly, touching the edges of the furniture, the frames on the walls. The house felt different now, not because anything had been moved, but because it was no longer a place I might lose. The weight that had been pressing on me for months was gone, replaced by a calm clarity. Martha stopped by in the afternoon. She carried no files this time, only a bottle of tea and a bag of fresh rolls from the bakery. We sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time in weeks, our conversation had nothing to do with lawyers or evidence. She told me about her granddaughter's school play, and I told her about the garden project I had been planning for spring. There was relief in speaking of ordinary things. Later, I opened the safety deposit box again, but this time it was not to secure anything. It was to take out the trust documents and review the language one last time. Everything was in order, the provisions clear. When the time was right, the assets would pass into the hands of the foundation I had established quietly months ago. The focus would be on education and practical support for women rebuilding their lives after financial or personal loss. That was the legacy I wanted, not a contested will or a family divided by resentment. As evening settled, I brewed a pot of tea and sat by the window. The neighborhood was quiet, the street lamps casting soft pools of light on the pavement. I thought about the path that had brought me here, the decisions made in silence. The careful steps taken when speaking too soon would have weakened my position. It would have been easy to let anger define these months, but that was never the choice I wanted to make. What mattered was reclaiming my place on my own terms, not proving a point to someone who had already shown me who they were. When I turned out the lights that night, the house seemed to breathe with me. Every lock was in place, every document secured, every plan aligned. The chapter was closed, not with spectacle, but with certainty, and that, I realized, was the best ending I could have asked for. Sometimes the hardest victories are the quiet ones, the moments no one else sees when you choose dignity over revenge. This story was not about winning in court or outmaneuvering someone. It was about refusing to let them rewrite who you are. If you've ever faced a situation where silence and patience were your greatest tools, you know the strength it takes. What matters most in the end is not that others recognize your victory, but that you walk away knowing you kept your ground, your values, and your peace. Would you have chosen the same path?